Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. Welcome to a bit of a discussion on speedruns. So I did promise to do a few guide videos on Tactics Ogre Reborn speedrunning, kind of how to do it, give some general clip notes, all of that kind of thing, as well as breaking down individual battles throughout the entire game, which I will be doing more of those individual breakdowns, but right now this is going to be the kind of cliff notes version of all of it, because frankly, life has been absolutely chaotic, so most of the stuff that you've seen has just been things off the backlog there. I've literally not even had enough time to completely finish routing all of Chapter 4, so either way, here we are. Let's discuss some different routes, some theories, some things to know, all of that kind of thing, and then hopefully once things die down a little bit, then it will be time to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of this stuff. Okay. So, first and foremost, one thing that I want to get into before we even get fully started is going to be the timer. So basically, when it comes to the timer, personally, I think the best way to actually judge this going forward is going to be in-game time, for a couple of reasons. For one thing, as far as I've seen in terms of different codes that have come up for different versions of this game, I have yet to ever see anybody actually manipulate the in-game timer. Is it technically possible? I'm sure it is, but there's so many different things that are verifiable in terms of, like, how much money was used, how many units were used, what kind of script triggers were triggered, to the point that it would become far more complicated for somebody to actually fake a run than it would be for somebody to just use the in-game timer, and, you know, learn to do it properly. So, personally, I think that kind of moderates itself in a way, and just kind of doing it off of something like that might potentially open up a lot more folks to this kind of idea, because it would essentially just be, you know, like, here's my save file, here's how I did it, you know, that kind of thing. Granted, it is kind of going back to the old, like, 80s and 90s method of, like, here's my picture of my arcade machine, but I personally think that it's a good way to approach it, but either way. Alright, next thing in terms of all this stuff is to bear in mind that while individual stats for a lot of units will, will matter, in many cases, the speedrun will essentially come down to figuring out counters and solutions to problems on the fly, which is why I personally find it really fun. So I will say, in many cases, it's going to seem like stats are being completely ignored, and that's because they are. Alright, so with that being said, also, this run is assuming for using no chariot whatsoever. I personally think the game's a lot more fun without it, but, you know, you do you. So, let's get to it. First of all, Chapter 1. So I did a few videos earlier on Chapter 1 and 2, and generally speaking, a lot of the same advice applies. So at the very intro, as far as the questions go, I personally go for just whichever one I'm feeling that day. Just pick a left, right, or center, and go for it. It's a lot easier to kind of play to the strengths of what your hand has dealt you, rather than trying to go for particular things at that exact time. You can stack for very particular things. If you want to go for one stat that's very easy to stack for, it's hard to go wrong with strength, simply because a lot of the answers are very obvious. If you see a question that sounds like, you know, it would have a very strongman answer, like, oh, who do you save? Well, I gotta save the family, or, you know, who, how do you solve the problem? Oh, you gotta do it with force. You know, if there's a obvious strongman answer, it's gonna be strength. That's one of those very few things that actually is very consistent about those questions, and you do get those a lot of the time. So the reason that it's hard to go wrong with that one is because there's the few times when Denim is more than likely going to get hit first, it's going to be physical hits, and in those cases, strength is also going to give you physical defense as well as physical offense. It basically helps two-thirds of the time and helps defensively the last third of the time. So either way, it's a very handy stat in particular, but either way, personally, I would recommend just kind of going with whatever you have on hand. Anyway, so we answer those as we will. The one thing I will say is that you want to start off with Ice Element. This is because you can't guarantee a Ice Charm, at least not conveniently, at the very start here. And we will essentially want to be running Ice. One thing I will say that was actually wrong about the first guide, as far as Vice's element, it is actually random. I thought it was always opposite, because the first few times that I was testing it, it was always opposite of Denim. But no, Vice's element is random, so you want to be opposing his element later on down the line. Either way, that is kind of fine where it is. In terms of these first three, what you want to do, so right here, Goliath will basically solve itself. For the 2 Almarca fights, the strategy is basically the same. Wherein you'll be trying to body block any squishier units than the leader in question. So you want to be running forward. You don't necessarily want to be attacking anything unless you're conveniently already by the leader as it is. Remember to do a lot of start and X as soon as you see the game stutter whatsoever to skip the scene. And then from there, you want to try to body block it because the AI will always attempt to go for the biggest number they can hit at any given time. So you want to land nearby a squishier unit, and you want to not attack if it's not the leader, and if it is the leader and you're just preventing them from attacking somebody else, then attack the leader or knock them towards one of the heavy hitters. This will apply to both our mark maps, and then that gets us to Tynemouth Hill, which is pretty straightforward. You basically just bum rush the wizard. You want to ideally try to circle off to the sides at first, which will cause him to pull forward in order to attack, giving you better access to charge forward. Crisaro is similar, however, you want to put, generally speaking, 2 or 3 units down the center. Don't bother attacking the skeletons or ghosts, so you just kind of stop and move. Don't bother trying to hit stuff unless you're shield bashing stuff off to the sides of that primary corridor running down the map. And generally speaking, you want to try to collect a physical up with Canopus, either 1 or 2 of them, and then just charge forward to just kind of lay the smack down on the Necromancer there. Which actually gets us over to Kadriga, which we will be doing Kadriga because this is the one big route difference from the first time around, because one of the most useful units throughout this particular route is going to be the Zombie Valkyrie that's available at Kadriga. However, we won't be taking this just yet. It'll be a lot faster when we do it later. So, from there we do Galborza, just split the party, have them both go both ways. At this point you have access to recruit, so immediately put that on any knights, put that on any rune fencers, put them on any units at all that can use recruit. So knights and rune fencers for now, clerics if you're feeling it. One thing I will note is we're not going to bother trying to figure out the specifics of what units to use. When in doubt, run with the rune fencers. But generally speaking, you have 3 knight marks at this point. You have no other class marks that are necessarily guaranteed. So what you want to do is take whatever you've got. If you want to run to the store and pick up some Valkyrie marks, go for it. Or some Mage Knight marks, rather. Sorry, my nose is bothering me, and I don't have a lot of time to cover stuff today. Anyway. So pick up those marks as you can, but realistically, just flip a couple units into knights. Your starting cleric should go ahead and switch over to a knight. Just saves you a little bit of time on setting them up. You're not really losing too much on weapon skills at this point. But yeah, recruit is really the main thing, because 1 or 2 recruits rolling will just instantly win you practically any fight in the game, so we want to be rolling that as much as we can. Generally speaking, the rule is you get something to half health, and then you just spam recruit, and then there you go. If you can recruit them before they die, great, otherwise just finish them off and move on. Don't try to get too obsessed with trying to get 1 unit in particular. Anyway, so at this point we move on to Rhyme. You just do this one as normal, isolate the leader. Usually I recommend to just agree to save Sistina because I think it makes her more aggressive, but honestly I'm not sure if it has any real effect, at least for the purposes of this run. It does improve your Chaos frame, which may be helpful down the road. If you don't agree to save her, the fight will not end if she dies, but realistically in this version she's a lot more sturdy, so I really wouldn't be too worried about her dying, especially with the kind of speed clearing the map. What you want to do is send Canopus up to the rooftops, have him snipe down at the casters, and then at that point nothing can reasonably threaten her. She's got an elemental advantage on most of the units nearby. So this actually gets us to the next point, in terms of knowing what to use when and where. Let's take a quick little side note here to talk about the units that you have on hand and what they're good at. So, why are we focusing on rune fencers for this team? Not only do they have recruit, but they're going to have the option to switch between different damage types. Damage is not a set thing. Generally speaking, melee is very stable, it's decently hard-hitting, and it's close range. Ranged will essentially vary wildly, having the lowest lows and the highest highs, and be able to attack from range, whereas magic, generally speaking, will have the lowest kind of maximum, but will have a pretty decent entry point. Unfortunately, obviously it takes MP to fire. So, with that all being said, a few things to bear in mind about your starting classes. So knights are fairly slow, but they have a recruit and they have a heal. Hopefully you won't need to use your heal, but they got they got a pretty handy suite of finishers. However, for the most part, we will be trying to focus on using rune fencers and Valkyries. because of the fact that later on down the road they will be able to consistently spam finishers. Conserve MP and meditate at the same time mean that they can constantly both cast and spam finishers at the same time. Additionally, in this early part, which this will be relevant in just a moment, we will be focusing very heavily on longbows. So with your starting archers, we probably will be ditching some of those right away, but we will be using Sarah. She's one of the few units that's guaranteed to have a very high preference for dexterity, which all of your unique characters do seem to roll random stats to some degree. But she has a very good preference towards her particular stats, and there's not many units that do. Surprisingly, Sarah completely outperformed even Aircell this time around when I was doing this particular test. Usually, Aircell's pretty well up there, but for some reason, Sarah is just really gifted this time around. Anyway, so we'll be using her, however, we will be swapping out all of the rest of our longbows throughout this entire run. It's faster to recruit new units and just use these higher skill units than it is to train up your own. We're not going to be stopping to do training at any point. Additionally, when it comes to casters, they've got a long casting animation. And generally speaking, we don't want to try to use these guys for damage because they are very squishy, they're very quick to get run down. So what we want to be using them for is long-range debuffs. If you end up picking one up, long-range poison and something like that, think of poison as effectively attacking 3 times per round. It's obviously going to be up and down, but generally speaking, it comes out to about 3 standard attacks per round that they're landing with poison, and that typically lasts about 2 to 3 rounds. So even though it is only 30% hit chance on the low end when using concentration, it is something that's worth considering using. Additionally, warriors, we use these for spacing. You keep Mighty Strike on there, you keep Vigorous on there. This is going to have a consistent way for you to push forward and push units out of the way. Knights can also do the same thing with shields, so just kind of use these as you will. Technically, warriors can use shields too, but hey, heavy weapon, Mighty Strike, it's going to hit a bit harder. Berserkers we're not going to use very much over the course of this run, because as good as Berserk and Sanguine Assault is, it's not necessarily going to be something that we will be able to safely recruit that often, and it's going to be a bit harder to set up than some of these other ones. Terror Knights we'll be using for some situations, like if you have a very, very target-heavy area, send one Terror Knight in with Lament of the Dead. It's kind of wear down that area in its entirety. But for the most part, the fact that Fear will effectively disable Recruit is going to be a bit of a problem for this particular route, so we really will only be using one of them, and only in particular situations. These other ones we're going to use situationally as stuff comes up. So Dragoons, if you find one, great, just go ahead and use it for its intended role. Ninjas, if they come with Envenom short bows, fantastic. Actually, it's worth in Chapter 2 and 3. In Chapter 3 in particular, it's worth picking up a basic shortbow and Envenom with a ninja, having at least 1 or 2 on the team, just to consistently spam poison, just to constantly keep those numbers rolling. Then Beast Tamers are going to be the most important crux of the entire team, but none of them will be sticking around. So early on, and this is actually why I'm getting to this part right now, early on we will be getting 3 Beast Tamer marks right here in Rhyme. You want to kill the first Beast Tamer that you run into, which will give you access to a Lobber unit. You immediately want to give them two Dynast King's Meads, and then a healing item. So the purpose of this guy is essentially just to serve as a spotter for your longbows. If you have any medium to light unit that you hit with a breach, and then follow up with a longbow, that is going to be by far the heaviest damage you're going to get off of anything up to this point. So essentially that's who I'm going to go for. For the sake of understanding why, something like Fear will reduce stats by 15%. Sometimes this is better, but most of the time the breach from that Dynast King's Mead or any other source that you can get it is going to hit harder. So that is going to be... okay. So, a little bit of an interruption there, but anyway, so... Again, to be clear, Warrior is for spacing and hard hitting, essentially focusing down boss units. They're very widely available, and they typically will come with the skills that they need. Vigorous means that they can't be parried, Mighty means that they're going to knock back. Archers typically will come with Tremendous Shot. Again, Eagle Eye will give them the ability to ignore parry. These you want to fire either on Squishies or breach targets. They're going to be your best long-range, consistent peck down whenever you need that kind of thing. Wizards and Enchantresses, generally speaking, slow movement, but they'll be pretty solid hits. They're going to be your best debuff spammers for around Chapter 1 and 2, but you want to try and retire them as time moves on. Clerics we won't be using for the most part unless they just happen to be something that we recruit out of convenience. Valkyries and fencers can serve any role as needed. Typically, when it comes to bows, they'll be a bit worse than the archer, but they'll be able to handle that job just fine. When it comes to melee, they'll have access to finisher spam. Again, they're kind of in that position where they're a bit worse than some of the others, but they'll be able to serve that role just fine. Usually you want to be running swords or spears on these guys, typically sword and shortbow or just spear. Don't bother with the shields in most cases. Always have recruit on them. In the case of the knights, sword, shield for the most part. If they come with axes, fine, whatever. Just kind of keep them with whatever loadout they came with. Just run them with that, and then just spam recruit wherever possible. Use these for body blocking. Terror Knights we'll use if they're conveniently there, or if we need to break through an area very quickly. But generally speaking, we're not going to go out of our way to use them, just because they interfere with recruit. Berserk we'll use for convenience, Dragoon we'll use for convenience, Ninjas are going to be your best overall DPS in the 3rd chapter. Again, please bear in mind, we're not talking about initial hits. Poison will out DPS pretty much anything in the game consistently if you use it enough. And in their case, the reason that we switched them to only a basic shortbow is because they will be able to fire more times and throw out more poisons on more units. That DPS alone will be enough to overwhelm healing against pretty much everything. Envenom is a 100% chance to poison. Their high agility means that they nearly will never miss. It's pretty much only a parry that can possibly stop them, and if you have them standing next to an archer with Eagle Eye, that is no longer possible. And then again, Beast Tamers are going to be your breach unit early on, use them as a backup melee unit, and then later on they'll be used as grenadiers. Okay, back to it then. In terms of the Vartan, you just use Canopus as you use Canopus. You know how to use Canopus. Anyway, so at this point, kill that Beast Tamer. He will drop 3 Beast Tamer marks. Use those one at a time. Use them sparingly. Use them on somebody who you don't really need for anything else. The good thing about Beast Tamers is that pretty much anybody can become them. Anybody using axes, fists, bows, blowguns, anything like that, switch them over to that class and they will do that job fine. All they need to do is be able to throw, which they all can do. Anyway, so at this point we have the Northern Conversation. At this point we'll then have the longest cutscene in the game with the music box, and then that gets us over to Lake Bordeaux. However, before we do that, that's when we'll be going over to Gadriga. We'll be quickly rushing forward, shield bashing and isolating the Valkyrie at the very front, and spamming a recruit to get her. She is the only unit that we're going to go out of our way to recruit. Try to get the soldier guy if you can, but realistically, at that point, you should, once you have her recruited, go ahead and focus down Mr. Necromancer guy, and then go ahead and get the hell out of there. You want to end that fight as quickly as possible. Generally speaking, send Canopus up to the back. Hopefully by that point he's at least gotten close to having a finisher or has one unlocked already. And then just focus him down. Throw a breach if you got it. Shouldn't take you too terribly long. Lake Bordeaux is essentially the river map there. What you'll be doing is just kind of charging forward as you do. Try to get the Hawkman over to the left. He is an archer guy, but having an extra Hawkman will never hurt for the purposes of this run. Just try to pick him up if you can. Otherwise, just try to isolate and deal with the leader as quickly as possible. The casters are very easy targets for any bows at that point. Generally speaking, I mean, it's not really anything too fancy. It's a pretty wide map. You just kind of deal with units as they come to you. It's a bit of a pushover fight. When it comes to Zaid Moore, this is why we kept Denim on the ice element earlier. So at this point, we'll be going ahead and giving a short bow to him. Now, optionally, you can actually switch him over to an archer at this point. And the best thing that you can do, especially if you happen to pick up any ice archers at any point here, is just get a breach on either one of the griffins. Ideally, the one to the top of the map will be the best one to go for. You get a breach on that griffin and then just hit them with everything. Again, longbows will be ideal, but just whatever you have on hand. Don't shoot immediately. Like, don't get them all the way down immediately because it will cause them to retreat, but wait for them to get kind of closer to the water, and then at that point just kind of hit them with absolutely everything. Once they end up reaching about 10%, that's when they'll just turn around and leave. Which then gets us to Balmamusa, which is the usual simple turkey shoot that it usually is, just usual longbows and frontliners, just charge down the hill. You can use casters if you want, but their firing lines are going to be a bit awkward in this particular case. So yeah, that just kind of gets us to our next one. So we're going to go ahead and go for Chaos in this one. which essentially gives you the kind of fight uphill. Well, they're both going to be uphill. This one will give you a fight against the resistance there. Now, interestingly enough, their actual loyalty is lower than it was in the PSP version for some reason. So, in this case, we're actually going to have an easier time recruiting them. So, as before, this one actually may result in a few casualties. Don't worry about it. Just charge forward, try to recruit a couple of units, ideally some frontliners. Usually what I like to do is essentially send one Fencer and Canopus off to the right. Canopus to harass the Squishies, the Fencer to attempt recruits. Everybody else focuses down the middle. We perch a couple of longbows over there on the rooftops just to peck away at whoever they can. Use some breaches on whoever's available. Feel free to kind of use at least a couple of those breaches to allow you to break through their initial frontliners, which will then make the rest of the fight a lot easier. Don't try to drag it out and save resources here. It will just simply result in a reset. Okay, this gets us to Chapter 2, and then if you want, there's Ravnus's final words. We're not going to be watching that, but as we live at Aceton, we then run into the air cell fight. So what you want to do is send one unit off to the left, 3 units off to the right, everybody else down the center. You can send only 2 units on the right if you'd prefer. But what we're looking at here is a case where the middle is more than likely going to get bogged down. If we send somebody over to the left, there's a decent chance that they will also send somebody to the left, and if we send somebody over to the right, then they won't be there to plug up the center. We shield bash anybody we can from the middle out of the way in order to try to circle around air cell on all sides. Her units are not terribly loyal, so as per always, get 1 or 2 recruits, surround her, hit her with breach, hit her with bows, and you're done. Next is the aqueduct. So this one's a bit more tricky. You've got a Terranite over on the left who's going to be breaking a bunch of units, and you've got some heavier, tankier octopi that are going to be popping up around as well. At this point, if you have any caster units on hand, I would recommend putting Poison Cloud on at least one of them. Just even that 30% is going to be enough to melt those guys down. This one can be a little bit longer, so it's going to be very helpful. You want to try to melt away at least one of them. If you have Tamers on hand, try to recruit them. Having access to a meat shield would be a very good time saver, and it could potentially help you out quite a bit. But it's a bit unlikely. They are fairly loyal to him. So typically you're looking at about 10 to 15% odds. It's not exactly enough to necessarily rely on. Bring water longbows if you got them. They have 2 firecaster units that are off in the back, and typically you can hit them for about 300s, give or take. So just, yeah, longbow range really helps a lot with how much open space there is. Don't even bother bringing some of the squishiers along, squishier ones along for this particular ride. The octopi are usually going to just run them over. So yeah, you want to try to carve through the center as much as you can. As per usual, surround Zapan, hit him with breach, beat him down. Once he's on critical, then you're done. Zaidmore is the Vance fight, one of the more challenging bosses in the early game. So, you have Aircell in your party for this one. She's going to start off with an elemental advantage against many of the units surrounding her on the top of the map there, and you'll be coming in from the left. So if you bring everybody straight forward in a line, you'll just get bogged down. So circle a couple of units to the left, circle a couple to the right, and send some heavy hitters down the center. You want to try to surround the center more so than go into it. And then as soon as Vance shows up, same as before, breach, hit it with everything. He is a bit tankier, so you want to hit him with your melee guys ideally. And from there, we can move on to Lake Bordeaux. So this is another one where it's as simple as throwing a breach on Genzo and hitting him with your longbows and calling it a day. Don't bother trying to do anything else here. I know that it's tempting to try and recruit the dragons. Don't bother. Anyway, can just end it quickly, and then at that point we get access to crafting. So this gets us to our first crafting run of the run. So what we want to do is go back to Port Ashton at that point, and we're going to make some things. So what you want to do is upgrade your longbows. Those are going to last you for a while, and I do mean like the regular old longbows. Don't bother upgrading many of your melee weapons, but you do want to get access to the Zwei +1 in particular. Get the Volge and get the Zwei. You want at least 3 Volges, 4 if you can afford it. And then the Zwei, you want to, again, have at least 4 of them on hand. From there, get at least 4 longbows, and then you want to upgrade your gloves and your pants. Ideally, chain leggings are probably going to be the most available piece of equipment for you, but what we're trying to do is get access to movement range and get access to additional jump height. We're not going to bother worrying with the chest pieces at this point. A, it's going to be too expensive to upgrade right now, and B, we simply don't want to have access to weight whatsoever. Later on, we'll be able to get that for free. For the time being, though, it's going to be more of a liability than it is going to be a help, because if you don't have Wade, you can't be knocked into the water, which means that we can't actually be knocked out of the way in some very important cases later. Anyway, once that's done, spend everything that's left on more breach items, and get access to a couple of poison clouds if you don't already have them. Though realistically you should just kind of have them on hand by that point. And anyway, this gets us over to Vice. So don't bother changing your element just yet. We'll want to counter Vice later on down the line, and his actual element will vary, so just leave it as it is for now. So for this particular fight, what you want to do is, first of all, pull all your units back. You're going to have, you're more than likely going to lose Aerosol at this point. Don't worry too hard about that. And then Cash was going to try to do as much healing as possible, but what you want to do is essentially hold out a few rounds. After about 3 rounds, Vice will charge his way forward, as per usual. Hit him with a breach, hit him with your melee units, just try to keep everybody spread out as much as possible, so that they can congregate on him as much as possible. If you have knights, put them out there with Rampart Aura to try and make sure that the other guys don't have much movement on hand. And then if you happen to get your knights behind them, shield bash him towards your own lines to give yourself an easier time beating the guy down. Again, breach, smash, done deal. Shouldn't take you too long. Alright, Chrysoro, or Chrysoro as I prefer to call it. So Pharrell is a bit of a tanky bastard, but same strategy as before. However, this time we want to try and rush forward and hold that area between those center 2 buildings as quickly as possible. His frontline units are extremely disloyal, so you want to try and recruit, again, at least a couple of them, and put them off on those buildings. Eventually, Pharrell will charge forward, and as before, you surround him, beat him down. You want to send the longbows up a little bit, though, because his back row support casters like to hang out along that little pier area on the bottom, and your longbows can just about reach that. So if you can reach them, fantastic. One thing that I would recommend, especially if you are running Canopus at this point, is to have him flying around collecting Fizz Up cards this entire time, to then try and hit him as soon as that breach hits. Basically, the breach should be the opener to anyone that you want to kill off when it comes to bosses, and so yeah, usually Canopus with a finisher, because of the fact that he's one of the few units that will have noticeably enough higher stats to make a difference, should be able to deal a significant amount to him just on one finisher alone. And anyway, from there you just finish him off with the other melee guys. Again, this one should probably take you a couple minutes, and moving on. Alright, Kadriga. So this is the one where you go with Fulkert to save Bayan. So Bayan will usually do a good job of dealing with those units on his own. But what you want to do is try to hold back, wait for the cockatrices to come to you. If you happened to have either picked up the Dragoon marks earlier on back in the Vice fight, if you happen to have killed the Dragoon in the process, then you will have had 3 Dragoon marks. Or if you managed to recruit that Dragoon, then this would be a good time to employ them. Just use Beast Slayer on them. Or if you happen to have any Tamers on your team at this point, which you should, you want to try and at least attempt to recruit a Cockatrice or 2, because they're going to be a very, very good unit to have. Generally speaking, Cockatrices and Griffins are going to be your go-to when it comes to long-range item delivery. And especially for Cockatrices, they're going to be a really good kind of roll-of-the-dice shutdown unit with their Petrification Breath, because Petrification is something that's pretty hard to get rid of. So anyway, that'll be that. Attempt to get those Cockatrices, but eventually Darza will charge forward, and as before, breach, beat, and we're moving on. Alright, so this gets us to the Pirates. They will go ahead and ask if you want to participate in saving Sistina. And this one's up to you. Technically, you're going and taking an extra fight in order to do so. And in this particular route, I went ahead and did so. Veldre isn't the hardest unit to take out. She has a tendency to charge forward, which, you know, breach and beat as you do. Now, that being said, this could be very handy because Bayan is a pretty hard-hitting unit, and essentially it would give you the entirety of the Liberation Front faction for your additional units there. Sistina is going to be one of your better kind of frontline Rune Fencer units, so that's kind of why I went this particular route, but you can easily just skip this part if you'd like. Either way, skip it or don't, we then get over to Goliath. So if you saved these three, they will be here. Just giving you an immediate 3-unit advantage, turning this fight into a complete cakewalk. All you got to do is send Canopus over to the right side and just snipe at their leader while everybody else charges forward like a complete, doofus mob. Attempt to recruit the ninjas if you can. They're going to have a few ninjas in the center there. Other than that, just try to land poisons. If you do have any poison ninjas over on the right side there, if you happen to get any at this point, I believe there's one that might have it. I could be mistaken, to be honest. Either way, what you want to do is just have bows over on the right side, just targeting Dagon as much as possible. He's a very squishy unit, even without anything. Don't be too surprised if you see half the dang map unconscious by the end of this fight. It's just how it goes. It's a very quick and dirty map, but most of the time all it takes is a couple shots on Dagon to have that fight done and over with. Alright, so next up this gets us to Archaeopolis of Rime. So this is the one where you're pretty much definitely going to get Denim hit immediately, that we were talking about a while ago. So in this case, what we want is to try to pull him back as much as possible. Now, depending on the unit, or depending on the class that you ran Denim as, this part can change significantly. So if you have him running as a fencer and he rolls his meditate, there's a pretty decent chance you're going to have access to a finisher right away. I know personally the best run that I've had of this, he was able to land a pretty solid finisher pretty much immediately and then follow it up with a couple of finishers off of Canopus. So that can work. However, if Zapan survives, he does have some healing support right behind him. So the very best ideal route to go is to try to push your main squad into that center cluster of 3 houses on the bottom right there, while pushing Denim back to the back left, where those 2 houses are on the bottom, that little corner right by the water. So kind of push him in that direction, which will pull Zapan in that direction. You park Canopus up on the rooftops, and as before, breach beat as you will. You can also just run a Dynast King's Mead on Denim at any given time to go ahead and just allow him to breach before the fight even starts, which would definitely help. So, either way, he's going to be right in front of Zapan one way or the other. Either one of those approaches will work just fine. So from there, that gets us over to Almorica, and this one can be a bit tricky, but as before, we're going to be relying on a good combination of alcohol and longbows. So, in this case, though, we're going to get charged by several different lines, and you don't want... The only unit that you actually have to take out in this particular fight is Ramitos, but you don't want to do that right away, because if you fire and you don't get the kill, they're going to go and run backwards, and you're going to have a much longer fight. Zapan, even though he's mentioned as a target, doesn't actually matter. So all you want to do here is try to get to that area at the top of the steps, that is to say, the first set of steps. Use Breach as much as possible from any of your melee weapons, so any of your Zouays, any of your Volges, anything like that. And just spam attack as much as possible. Use Vigorous attack if you got it. Vigorous, again, guarantees secondaries, so if you've been using Warriors at this point, you should see that debuff coming out pretty regularly. And using that, you can make sure that the frontliners are low on health, low enough that the clerics will decide to charge forward, and that's what you want to do. You want to pull the clerics forward, you want to make sure that that they're at least reasonably close by and they have something else to heal. You want to make sure that Ramitos never gets above the percentage of health as those frontliners, because that is when they will end up getting the heal instead. But doing this, you'll be able to attack them once, wait around, and then basically give it your all on the second round. Typically, it will take 3 longbow shots to take care of Ramitos, but you don't want to do 2 shots because then they'll get healed. Instead, you want to do 1 shot, wait, then 2 shots. Unless you can land all 3 at once, which is pretty unlikely given the amount of Rampart Aura units that they've got. So, that is about that there. Alright, next up for Almorica Passageway, switch to the opposite of whatever Vice was. So hopefully you paid attention to what element he was. Either way, switch to whatever his opposite element was. If you've been running a Rune Fencer at this point, which you should have, you should be running him with swords, hopefully. At which point, all you really have to do is run up and get hit. At which point, hopefully, Meditate will trigger, and/or you can just use one of your MP items at this point. Use only finishers on him so that it doesn't build up his own finishers. So you charge up, you charge in, you let him hit you, you reply with a finisher, you heal, he eventually replies with a finisher of his own, use 2 more finishers, and you're done. Between Meditate and one MP item, this should be a complete cakewalk. It consistently has every time that I've gone through it. Alright, and then this gets us to Chapter 3. So at this point, this is kind of the big pivot, as it were. So this is what the party should, vaguely speaking, look like at this point. So, anyway, the actual specifics of the party will vary depending on who you hired. What we want is essentially something like this. We've got some randos that we've kept around for this whole time. We've kept Sarah along with a longbow up to this point. We've gone ahead and used additional archers as they've come up, and then we've used the neutral trio, although Bayan had died by this point, and so had Canopus. So he was replaced by Mr. Folk over here. Again, units will die, this is fine. It's just how it goes sometimes. Anyway, so what we want is, again, to just have recruit units up in the front, longbows in the back, and then we start working in the explosive stuff. At this point, we'll go here, we'll see that we have a pretty frickin' penny when it comes to all of those items. We want to go down here, sell your helmets, and sell any leftover shields and other items like that you have. So typically shields are going to sell for a lot. You're usually going to not really need most of the spare equipment because your units that you're hiring will already come kitted out. So no need to worry about this stuff. We won't be bothering to switch classes for the most part. But this will leave us with a pretty solid amount of money, and especially if you sell the Baldur stuff, that stuff is particularly expensive. And what we want to do at this point is just pick a particular type of shot that you like. Now you can tailor these shots to get slightly more damage to go for any kind of particular damage that you like, or to match the particular element of the unit using it. It is technically going to be more optimal to do so, but for the purpose of simplicity, I just go in here, and what I usually do is I go in and usually I won't lose my train of thought, but we go down to the sundries, and we'll go ahead and pick up some South plus ones, probably pick up like 20 of them. Usually you'll have a pretty decent amount of blessing stones, but you want to have about 20 of those on hand. Pick up some plumes for your longbows. Every now and then you just want to pop one on there when you think it'll be difficult. We can stop spending money on meads at this point, although we will end up getting some more as drops later. And then from there we spend everything else on whatever shot you prefer. Again, I prefer conflagration shots because they're bright red and they stick out. So what to note at this point is that any unit that is to say, any unit that has a skill of some kinds can switch out for this particular thing. You should have a few Beast Tamer marks at this point. I only used one up to this point in the run, but either way, you switch over to a Tamer, and the damage of these shots is directly reflected by their weapon skill. So whatever their weapon skill is, that's what you'll be doing. You want to pick up these things last so that they show up last in the list, and you can just make sure to pop them on here. If you want to go pick up a Mending Salve or whatever else is your last throwable, go for it. But again, this affects this. The rest of the stats don't even matter for this particular part. All we need is Lobber, weapon skill, and this. Alright, so you want to kind of keep this unit updated with whoever has the highest skills on hand. So we're actually going to go ahead and load up the latest part of this particular speedrun to show you what I'm getting at here. Don't worry, it did not take 2 days for this particular one. This is a completely different run that we're not going to talk about right now. But what we're going to do is go over here to... yeah, that'll do. And we'll take a look at some things that we'll be addressing up to this point. So, that first fight of... Alright. That first fight of Chapter 3 is pretty straightforward. You just handle it like all the others. Surround the guy, breach, pummel as you do. He has a tendency to hang out around the center of the map, which means that he should be pretty easy to single out. Zaidmore is a lot more difficult, but if you've got some earth units, I believe Feldnator is a lightning unit, if I'm not mistaken. Either way, you want some melee units that are opposite his element. as before, breach, beat down with melee units if you can, and then try to shield bash him towards your lines, fairly standard. Crit and I can be handled with longbows. Just don't even need to bother with the breach. Gildor is pretty squishy. You can just kind of keep firing at the squishies nearby her and land finishers on her in particular. Generally speaking, low health. She has a pretty decent amount of damage, but you want to just focus on the bridge. All you want to do is push forward on the bridge. You'll get some reinforcements from the right side of the map. Ignore the left side entirely. They're just going to waste their time. And all you want to do is, again, just push forward. Any melee units that they've got, just push them off to the side, isolate, beat down as you will. As much breaches as possible would be handy. They've got one healer nearby that's a bird. As before, just target with longbows, target with any ranged attacks that you've got. As soon as Gildor is available at the bottom of the steps, just kind of wear her down. Alright, and then we get to Zabos. This one's going to be one of the more difficult ones, and this is especially where you want to have at least 4 fencers with Volges, just kind of constantly spamming out breaches as much as possible. This is one of the few that you really will want to be clearing out almost the entire map in order to deal with him. Now, Zabos doesn't have any heals of his own, but he does have 2 very kind of well-hidden healers way in the back of his little kind of entrenched area back there. He has a lot of units that like to go on the sides, and unfortunately this means that they can fly, they control the area underneath the bridge, and they won't charge very much if you decide to hang all the way back. They'll actually just wait for you. So what you want to do is wait for the first wave to come in. Basically, you go about 2 tiles out onto the bridge. They'll start sending a few units out. Do the same, breach, beat down, all of that kind of thing. At which point they'll start sending everybody else. Now, they've got a lot of area control units, so the trick to this one is just isolating and dealing with everybody as quickly as possible. Just 1 unit at a time. Deal with them as quick as you can. As before, spam recruit as much as possible, especially the birds. If you can get rid of the birds, it becomes a lot easier, because they have a tendency to show up in the most annoying locations. Zabos himself is incredibly tanky, so you're usually going to need about 2-3 rounds to surround the guy and beat him down. But the priority is eliminating the healers that are going to be in the back there. So if you can send longbows kind of down to the center of the bridge, deal with them, that'll make this fight dramatically easier and actually possible. Other than that, poison's going to be your best friend here. Alright, so one thing that's of particular note that I really should have probably mentioned sooner at this point is that when it comes to poison and stun arrows off of ninjas, a lot of units will have resistances to poison, stun, all that kind of thing. That only matters for the caster version. You should have replaced all casters by ninjas with ninjas by this point. But basically what this will do is just, it's 100%. 100% doesn't care how much you resist it. 100% is 100%. So it will guaranteed inflict those particular debuffs. And a lot of stun and a lot of poison will go a long way. So the trick here is to run a couple of ninjas. One, essentially just having stun in the leftmost slot and then poison in the rightmost slot. Everything else can just kind of be as you'd prefer. But this basically means that essentially it will prefer poison, but if it doesn't have poison, it will attempt to use stun. And there's a pretty decent chance that you'll be running one or the other. So Steel Stance and then the debuff skills, Ninja's can absolutely carry in certain situations, but again, that will be fairly random. So just bear in mind that those debuffs are going to be very, very handy in this particular situation. Because again, many bosses are not actually immune to that kind of stuff. Alright, next up, we go to Reason Away. Fly forward, shoot Cassandra, move on. Next, we get to Sir Hector. So yeah, Snow Hector is a bit of a challenge at times, but not too much of a challenge. So, what we do is similar to before. We go ahead and we hang out in a line, kind of like we did for back with, what's-his-face, Zabos. And we wait for them to charge forward. Hector will charge forward as well. He'll usually take a spot around the center there. So hit with breach as much or as early as possible, and then you want to try and sneak a ninja or two back there to harass the healers. So he's got 2 healers, and you want to just annoy them as much as possible. Shoot at them, shoot at somebody nearby them. Just keep them occupied with something. And then ideally you want to try to hit Hector with as many debuffs as you can. Again, Breach is completely unresistible, so if you can land that on him, perfect. By this point you should be using entirely Volges and Zways to inflict those particular debuffs. So just hit that on him, surround him. Your main goal is just to surround Hector by any means necessary. Now, personally, I did this the last time around by just switching any Hawkman into a warrior. It's worth picking up some warrior marks at some point to go and just make sure that you have a unit that can kind of guarantee this kind of stuff. And Hawkman in particular is great for this because that just allows you to land your Vigorous wherever you want it. So either way, they're really great as flankers. So just kind of like flank with a Hawkman, put your other 3 melee guys on opposite sides, and there you go. He doesn't really have any knockback moves that he'll use consistently unless you have somebody particularly squishy enough for him to bother using a shield on. But either way, he can be a little bit slimy, but you want to just distract his healers and then just beat him down with Breach as you do. So just go for that Hawkman flank if it's possible. Otherwise, just try to flank with any other unit. Remember that it doesn't matter how squishy the unit is. If they're blocking the tile, they are blocking the tile. So if you can surround him somehow as quickly as possible, this fight becomes a lot easier. The only two tricks are the only two keys here are distracting those healers and making sure that he's surrounded. Alright, moving on. And by the way, that actually should be fairly easy because in a lot of cases you can get him pinned against that wall in the center there because he does like charging down the center. So this is easier than it looks. You just want to try and kind of block everybody else out of the fight as much as you can, end it as quickly as you can. Alright, so next up we get to South Curtain Wall, just like before. We will completely ignore Canopus's advice, but what we want to do here is fly some Hawkman up to the top. Now what I did in this case was just essentially fly one bird up to the center to run distraction. I ran the zombie up to up the left side here to once again serve as a distraction. The reason that we picked up that zombie earlier, I know it's something I really should have brought up more up to this point, but I'm in too much of a rush to explain this crap. The point of that zombie is essentially a renewable aggro bubble, more or less, that when it comes to a map like this where there's a bunch of archers and whatever else, they will always target that zombie, who then just immediately comes back to life. So we want to try to abuse that as much as possible. We throw some XP charms at them every now and then, but we consistently want to keep them about 2 to 3 levels under everybody else so that they're always the more tempting target. Almost nothing will carry exorcism, so we don't need to worry about this up until we get up to Morn. Either way, we use that kind of decoy beacon zombie, as it were, and then we push everybody else up the right, and then use Canopus to spam finishers onto the wizard, and then we move on. Alright, and then this gets us over to Zabos 2, as before. Kind of Breach and Poison his front line. Poison is going to matter a ton here because it's golems and cyclopes. Longbows against his caster units on the sides, especially the wedge, and then just Poison and Breach versus the Terranites, at which point you just surround Zabos and beat him down. His healers are a lot easier to reach in this particular map. It's a far more open map, but just maneuver Poison as much as you can. But either way, it's a lot easier than the first time. Then we get up to Modigliani. Just longbows, that's all you need here. Then we get to Tanai, where we get Marino, and just like last time, you just take the right side up the bridge, Breach, and this time you would just want to beat down with melee units. Honestly, the Breach will handle itself. He doesn't have as much support as Gildora did. Just push units out of the way, push Marino forward, and you know, give him the mob treatment, basically. Alright, then we get to Karitnai Ward, and you can actually handle this one whichever way you'd prefer. I feel like the duel is faster. So what you want to do is switch Denim over to the Fencer if he is not already a Fencer, and all you do is pop to the bottom right of the map. You give him any movement boosted pants, and all you really got to do is just consistently shoot him with spells of different varieties, and or just use a spear. You just run left to right, up and down that little ledge there, and he will also repeatedly just run left to right, attempting to reach you. So you shoot or stab, you run away, he follows you, and you just repeat this until he's done. Very easy. Moving on. this one with Gamp here can be a bit more complicated. The trick here is to try to get him isolated. Like, you see that spot in the like on the right side there where there's like that little bridge sticking out. You want to try to get him surrounded by at least 2 units over there. He's not super tough, but the thing is, you can't just attack his griffins this time around. It has to be Gamp in particular. And usually, while it is only about like a breach and 2 hits to get him done, he's not the tankiest unit in the world. He does have a healer support with items that are able to fully heal him. And also, usually your back row is going to get completely annihilated by his birds. So if you have any casters, don't even bother bringing them. If you have any longbows, they're typically going to last a couple of rounds. But if you have any meads left over, this would be a good place to use them. But really, you want to just charge up whoever you can to get close to them. Finishers and melee hits are usually going to be the most reliable in this particular case. Just again, if you got fencers, they're going to probably be some of the more reliable ones. A couple of rending gales on top of a breach will definitely do the job. But you just get them critical, and that's the end of that. Okay, so next up we got Rhyme. This is another one that unfortunately takes a little bit of a while. You got units all over the map, and getting access to their leader is a bit of a problem. If you recruited an octopus earlier, this would definitely be one of the times to break them out, but by this point you should have incorporated Hobram into your team, so instead of using Plumes, you should be using him to keep everybody strengthened up as much as possible. What you want to do is send about 3 or 4 units to go deal with that entire right island as quickly as possible, especially the healer. And then, if you have any units, especially Hobram who have Wade on them, you want to wave them out into the center. Any of your rune fencers should be able to just do this innately. If you did go back to upgrade your armor at any point, that'll work too. But you want to just take that little area to the right of that bottom island and circle around behind Hiram. At which point you do the old surrounding and beatdown strategy. Otherwise, as soon as you start attacking him, he will run away. The left side, you want to try to use a couple of units to try to just hold them off there. Personally, I used one knight and the zombie rune fencer to do that, but there's a lot of ways to potentially go about it. If you have cockatrices, that'll do a great job too. He's got some casters in the back row, but really it's just pinning down Hiram that's the problem here. And yeah, as soon as you have him surrounded, you're done. Moving on. Okay. So now, the thing with chaos versus neutral, this is a fight you basically gotta do immediately, and then in chaos you get a bit more time here. So he shows up a bit tougher, but you have more options available, whereas in neutral you do have to just take him on right away with what you got. However, due to the fact that we've got some bigger numbers on our side, the optimal strategy for dealing with this is a lot easier to pull off. So all you do is you pull everybody back to the very, very back of the map in one flat line and wait for Oz to charge forward. As soon as he does, like, don't take the bait for any other units. As soon as, like, if any other units charge forward, wait for them to directly come in close, surround them and deal with them. If you can't surround and crush them within 1 round, don't bother moving, just sit there and recover. But then as soon as Oz gets close, same as before, breach, beatdown, drop finishers. You should have finishers loaded up on everybody, and really he should get pretty close. If you have any units with any ability to drop a silence on him, that would be ideal at this point. So if you happen to get any mute dart blowgun drops at this point, or if you happen to have any Balder +1s on hand, like basically if you have a Balder shortbow and you have a problem with this particular fight, get that upgraded before the fight starts. That'll give you a far easier time. Certainly you want to silence him. That'll make him want to get into melee range, at which point, just like with everybody else, you surround, beat him down. Don't try to leave that back corner, because that it's just giving them a massive advantage. Alright, next up, that gets us over to this thing that I can't select apparently. Come on, there we go. Alright, then we get to Fidalk. As you'd kind of expect, you just charge. So this is one of the reasons that we always want to upgrade our gloves, because that right wall can be a massive problem if you hadn't. Forces you to take that route on the left. Otherwise, this time around, all we do is send up our Hawks and our faster units without taking any actions to take those forward stairs as quickly as possible. Just zombie rush that shit up to those stairs, surround Vestiary, and do the usual surround and beatdown thing. If you've got any bonus swiftness available on your fencers, this would definitely be the time to use it. Just charge forward as much as possible. I wouldn't recommend using siege even in this particular situation. Just use shields to kind of punt any rampart aura units out of your way. Siege just won't be worth it, even in this case. It's, I mean, arguably there could be a case made for it, but it's just most of the time they're blocking you in such a way that it really won't help anyway. But yeah, she is particularly weak. If you have any birds, really a couple of birds by themselves would be enough to take care of this. You send everybody else in to just kind of provide a cover, and that'll be that. Moving on. Alright, then we get to Great Hall. This one is super chaotic, and you want to deal with it, as always, as quickly as possible. So first order of business is to try and pull everybody to the left to the bottom of the stairs. You want to make sure to get your longbows over on the healer on the right side, the one that supports Oz, as quickly as possible. You take him out, you breach Oz, you surround Oz, you beat down Oz. From there, Ozma will come down and start, thoroughly whooping everyone's ass. So what you want to do at that point is make sure that you have Canopus and or any other hawks surround her healer, at which point the fight is basically done. You just got to surround Ozma, and that's the end of that. But you want to try to get as many recruits from the bottom side as possible. Their loyalty is on the lower end, but ideally you want to try to get their Hydra. If you can, that Hydra is a absolute godsend for this part, because essentially that is a poison explosion that is going to be very handy, especially once you get access to Dragon Eye. However, for the time being, it's not necessarily going to be 100% guaranteed by any means, so really you want to just try to surround her as much as possible and just hit her with whatever you got on hand. Expect to lose some units. This one's a pretty difficult one. Just never stop being on offense. That's really all there is to it. Just try to do whatever you can to try to deal with both Oz and Ozma as quickly as possible. Don't try to make it clean, because it ain't gonna happen. But again, Oz's healer, then Oz, then Ozma's healer, then her. The Knight will attempt to heal there too, but you want to try to recruit them. Same thing with their Terror Knight, same thing with their Beast Tamer. Just spam recruit, and you will have enough units to make it through. Alright, and then that gets us up to Chapter 4 here. So, first order of business behind Highlands. I mean, charge forward with everybody, hit the squishy guy on the other end of the river. Not exactly rocket science. Which at this point you skip this next fight entirely by simply taking all of the items off of Denim, sending him in alone, and then you'll just negotiate the fight instead of going into it. Then we get into Hedon. So the trick to this fight is to try to entirely block off all tiles in the center. All you gotta do is get one unit off to the other side of the map, because all of La Raza's backup is entirely on the 3 islands closest to you. He's got pretty much nothing over nearby him, so if you got any faster flyers, like if you still have Canopus as a Barton, if you still have any of the other Hawks, if you have any of that, all you got to do is just get a couple units close to him. He's got nothing for defense, so yeah, that would be the end of that. A couple finishers, and you're done to move on. Alright, so next up is Baya Hanbanuba. So this one's not as... I don't know why some folks find this tricky. It's a super simple fight. Literally all you do is line up your archers along that top ridge, wait for Sherry to start approaching those crystals on the bottom left. Once she gets close, same as before, just fire and that's it. Really the trick is just to make sure that she's not dead, at which point all you really got to do is just use only tremendous shots. Your crits can't go above their crit damage. Typically 2 or 3 arrows will be enough to see her knocked into critical, at which point she leaves. If you kill her off, you won't be able to recruit her. Either way, moving on. So at this point, this gets us to Sherry here. So here's the thing. In order to get her, she is a very simple recruit. All you really got to do is go over to the Balmamusa map and then go on and off it over and over until she spawns there. The only trigger to actually get her to show up is Olivia's loyalty. This is why, if you've noticed, I've never mentioned adding Olivia to the team up to this point. It's because you don't want her on the team so that she doesn't get knocked out and lose loyalty. Most of the time she'll gain a skill and, gain loyalty along the way, but realistically, you just want to make sure that she's not losing any loyalty. So either way, you go on and off that map, who knows, a couple dozen times until she just shows up. Now, this is completely optional, and this is actually one of those weird things where technically we're just recruiting her for her weapon skill alone, because personally I feel like just changing her and Olivia into beast tamers at this point is going to be faster than using them as casters. They have great casting stats. The thing is, we don't always know the meta will be available, and it's not always going to be reliable, especially at this point in the game. So later on they get a far bigger chance to shine, but at this point, shots and witches are typically going to be doing the same types of damage, but shots are essentially, you can use them whenever. They're boosted up by physical cards, and you're not going in your weapon skill, and you don't have to use MP to use them. Because we're ending fights pretty quickly, shots are typically going to be more expensive, but they're going to be a lot quicker for clearing those maps. You may have noticed back in Chapter 2 we could have afforded over 100 of those things. So essentially, by this point, we can afford to do a lot more than that. Whereas if we were to use these witches here, essentially we would have a unit that constantly would get targeted, constantly would get disabled. Beast Tamers are a lot more bulky and have a backup in terms of being able to switch into their finishers immediately after using those shots. Not to mention, they can get into position a lot easier due to the fact that they've got a additional tile of movement range. So either way, decide on that as you will. Personally, I feel like switching both Sherry and Olivia into Beast Tamers at this point to use them as Grenadiers is just kind of the optimal way to play this. But either way, I'm sure there will be more things discovered down the line, but it's just a lot more consistent. So this gets us over to the northern invasion here. So one thing I should mention about shots and their implementation. The thing about shots is that they're not just for the lobber units. I typically like carrying one, for example, on pretty much everybody, for a number of reasons. For example, like the zombie one is obvious. You give them some shots, they basically run up and they self-destruct stuff, that's perfectly fine, but I also like keeping shots on many of the other Frontliners as well, because it's not just those situations, but it allows them to attack diagonally as well. So for example, if you're one tile out of range, you can still hit if you're using a shot. If you are using somebody that's essentially just going to regenerate, you can always just have them self-destruct early and come back to life sooner. If you have cases where they can throw them, fantastic. And typically short bows or blowguns are going to be fantastic as a weapon skill for them, because you can constantly keep training it up in the background. But in most cases, like you'll notice at this case, the Beast Tamer at this point, his bow skill is only 24, and that's with some training. However, if we instantly were to switch over both Sherry and Olivia here, you can see they come in with higher weapon skills, which means that they will immediately be doing better with those shots. So regardless of stats, again, bear in mind, even with a 30 intelligence advantage over here, Sherry is still doing comparable damage to Olivia here with those shots. Now, in Olivia's case, I made an exception of picking up some water shots and also picking up an orb, because during the second trip to the store, you'll already be buying more stuff, so it is worth kind of preparing for the full end game, as it were, by stacking multiple types of different shots and everything else. But at this point, we've already more or less done most of our shopping for the entirety of Hanging Gardens. So essentially, I've gone and picked up some water shots for Olivia. At this point, I'm just having Saria continue as her Valkyrie self over here. We're going to be doing a final restock later when it comes to Blessing Stones and things. Merton and Gildas, I actually totally forgot to mention up to this point, but yeah, essentially just running Breach and Poison builds as it were here, running Velocity Shift. They've been the consistent frontliners up to this point. I can't believe I forgot them. They're just so dang mundane, I constantly forget that they're there. Anyway, yeah, they're the consistent frontliners here. When it comes to rings this time around, you don't have to worry too much about, giving them any additional rings. Just give them whatever you got. They all give a pretty much equivalent bonus for the purposes of what we're doing here. Sure, it'll help to give them like a ring of the Horde or whatever else, but realistically, anything will do just fine. Anyway, so a couple of other notes also, if in terms of your frontliners, just some things to note. It appears that the actual using the finisher and using the weapon do count entirely as different things. So, for example, the Sonic Blade here, essentially you are paying 40 MP to take a higher damage hit for Well, if we look at this, it's recovery time plus 34 to swing the Bastard Sword normally, but it's only 15 to use Sonic Blade. So you're essentially swinging twice as fast using Sonic Blade at the cost of 40 MP. In the case of something like a White Knight here, this is worth spamming constantly. Lightning Strike is more to take advantage of water units, essentially going to have higher recovery time, but this is pretty significant. So you're essentially going to take your next turn about 10% faster using something like Sonic Blade, give or take. So either way, swap out your units as you will. As far as having specific units doing specific jobs, I switched Volkert over to a Terror Knight at this point, just to have an easier time of kind of remembering which unit is the Terror Knight. Not to mention he's pretty fast, so it kind of overcomes the inherent weakness of that class. Most of the others are still running basic classes. Again, Valkyries are just very reliable up to this point. This is that same zombie from before. I actually, once again, forgot to mention earlier, you can also pick up an Instill early on to give them their Instill shield here, which will cover up their elemental weakness for the most part. And then, yeah, Hobram, just kind of like run him as he is. There's not really any reason to change him. This was just a random cleric that we picked up, and yeah, we're still running all the same old basic stuff. And then Barnisha, basically same old strategy as before. You find the leader, you shield bash him towards your units, you know, velocity shift, beat down, breach, all of that kind of thing. And then what you want to do is back over here where there was that cutscene with the Pope guy. And he was asking, hey, are you sure that you want to fight your sister? What you want to do is say, hell yeah, I want to fight my sister, you know, gotta do what I gotta do. At which point, she will not show up for this fight, which will make it dramatically easier, because essentially all you do is hang out at the bottom of the stairs. Eventually, Alphonse will charge his way forward, and as with every other leader, surround, beat down, you know, that's about that. Same strategy goes all the way up till here, up until we capture Heim. When it comes to the Tatar Castle, all you got to do is wait for Meatball to charge forward. As you do, he loves to charge all the way down the rampart and through the stairs. He'll just come straight to you, and again, surround, beat down as you do. So that gets us up to Hanging Gardens. Now, Hanging Gardens, I would recommend just playing straight, because if you take the shortcuts, a lot of those maps are a lot harder this time around. And given that we're not doing any training, I would say just take the extra fight or two, just doing the standard route through Hanging Gardens. You may lose a little bit of time there, but honestly, taking on Phoenixes is just going to suck with this party loadout. Usually you want to be able to leaden them and shield bash them. You can do it, it's just low odds to do it, so for consistency's sake, I would just say take the normal route. As far as the final shop at this point, what I would recommend doing once you end up hitting 40 is you want to go and you want to make sure to pick up additional... where's my inventory here? Sorry, kind of running a little bit out of steam here, as it were. So you want to pick up additional shots. Typically, you want at least 50 of each kind. If you want plumes, you're going to want at least 20 for the final push. Just they're there to kind of feel it out in terms of like when you feel you're going to need a little bit more. Just so you know, you're going to be running at least a couple shots on everybody for the final fight there. So bear that in mind for your economy for your shots. For Halloween Stones, you're going to be seeing a lot of fights going forward. So ideally at least 20. You know, hopefully up to 30, depends entirely on what you can afford, what kind of drops you've gotten up to this point. Feel free to sell any spare equipment at this point. We're not going to be changing anybody's classes. Beast Tamers would be ideal. We're not going to bother going for Fusiliers or any other classes. We would just go straight into Hanging Gardens at this point. Which again, we'll be covering more of the kind of specifics of all this route as we get into the more detailed guides. But yeah, standard route through, and then you exclusively use shots when you get to Dorgy. It allows you to, you basically just wait until his shield is down there. You throw a bunch of shots, or hit him with your frontliners, at which point until you get into phase 2, and then everybody just bombs the crap out of the guy, and that's that. The thing is, the shots get around his defenses, so it'll hit harder than anything else. If you've picked up any physical cards at that point, they'll typically end up hitting dramatically harder. So either way, I don't even remember if I mentioned that about the shots up to this point. They get roughly, I think it's like a 25% something damage boost from physical cards, which gets ridiculous because you can be seeing them hitting 600s or 700s consistently through armor and whatever else at this point. Technically, there's a way to make them hit harder by starting the Elemental Temples and then just going to pick up the Codex of Jewelry 4, but honestly, it's a lot of extra fights when you can just go and take your 400 damage and, consistently and go about it that way. Again, just use the honeybee strategy, just pile on the guy, explodify him, and that's about that. You just use your fixed damage bullshit to carve your way through him, and that's the end of that. I was hoping to have a bit more of an example set up by this point, but like I said, it's just been way too crazy. I have not had that consistent time to just sit down and plow through what's left consistently. Yeah. So, more detailed guides to follow. Hopefully this was a helpful little Cliff Notes thing on the route. I believe optimal time should be, like, if all RNG goes nicely and everything else, I believe it should be in about the 8:30 range. This was a fairly casual run with a few extra kind of bits and pieces kind of pulled in here. Roughly speaking, it's roughly about an hour or two by the end there. Easily, there was about an hour of extra fights that just didn't need to be taken up to this point, and even then, with some better luck, I'm pretty sure you could shave an extra hour off that, no trouble. Through some better inputs, probably take another half hour off. There's a lot of optimizations to do here. This is, like I said, a very Cliff Notes version, so we'll get into that when there's more time to do it. But either way, so hopefully this was helpful. I will see you guys in the next thing, and yeah. Hopefully the video on whatever the hell this is will make more sense by the time that this is out. I think I was originally just going to make that like a 10-hour long video, but I think I might just release it in multiple parts. Alright, anyway, I'll see you later.